Okay, hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you welcome to the second webinar in the Blue Thread series, which we launched about a month ago in October. So that was very successful, and we discussed SDG 6, achieving sustainable access to water and sanitation for all, which was a big subject to try to grab hold of, and I think we did a good job. And actually, come to conclusion, I think that the challenge really isn't technical. It's probably more political and financial. So when we were thinking about the next topic to address, the one that came back from a lot of people was biodiversity, which is what today is all about. So as you can see, Blue-Green Harmony, a deep dive into biodiversity and the water sector. So in the next hour or so, we're going to try and develop and deepen our understanding of the critical interplay between water and biodiversity. We've got three fantastic guests, very knowledgeable people that I'm delighted have given us their time to do it. So as I said, we chose this because a lot of people have said about biodiversity. So how can we teach people and learn a little bit more about biodiversity, particularly in water sector? First of all, some housekeeping. As you can see during the webinar, your microphones are muted, but that doesn't mean we don't want you to get involved. Please do so, post questions in the chat, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end of the thing. So the idea really is we have the guest says does some slides and has some thoughts. Then there's a couple of questions, and then at the end of it, there's a general Q&A. Also, I would say to people, don't be shy. No question is too basic. I can guarantee you, if you want to ask it, somebody else wants to hear the answer. So we are also on all the social media platforms with hashtag the Blue Thread. So please use it and get the message out there to as many people as you can, so we can build this community and continue to learn all together. So just for any newcomers or people who are here really for the first time, thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime and a very warm welcome. My name is Mark Smith. I'm the Water Sector Director for RSK Group. I've been a water professional for more than 30 years. And, you know, it's a long time in an industry, and I spent all my life in the industry, but I do remain curious about how we interact with water as a society, and that's developing, of course, all the time. I do think it's fair to say that at times I get worried about the direction of travel we seem to be going in terms of society, in terms of interaction with water, and particularly biodiversity. But I am still optimistic that we have the solutions. We just need to find the will, and that will therefore be the way. So today is all about learning from me. And I think, how do we actually continue to build the water sector as something that is intrinsic to everybody's life? There are great people working in this sector, and today you will meet three of them. You know, they all do different things, but they're all working with water and with biodiversity. So it's not a lack of talent we suffer from, it's more a lack of, I would say, joined up strategy. So as I said, the title says Blue-Green Harmony, a deep dive into biodiversity in the water sector. And we are going to take a look at that. And as a very high level explainer, I was looking at National Geographic, and biodiversity refers to every living thing on the planet, including bacteria, fungi, plant, animals, and of course ourselves. And why is it important? Because it essentially makes the earth habitable. It supports human health and animal health, and it supports economies, it supports business, and of course it supports all our well-being. So I think, interestingly, biodiversity is a new term into the water sector, new in the last few years. Before that, people didn't even mention it. Now I think it's really important. So I think we have three people who are going to really help us, and each of them take a slightly different approach to the topic. So I would say, if at the end of this session you have not been stimulated to find out more or learn something new, then we're not doing our jobs. But I really am confident that today both of those things will happen. So first up is Eloise Sohanek. So she is a lifelong ESG professional, and she is the RSK Sustainability Manager in the very aptly named Sustainable Engineering Solutions Division. She has over 15 years experience in this subject area and works within the voluntary sector as well as within corporates. She's also very well traveled, and I noticed actually when I was reading LinkedIn, she's done an extended break traveling the world for her honeymoon. So she knows a lot of different ecosystems, and in her day job, she leads on sustainability for quite a number of different companies that all operate within the water sector. So Eloise is going to start us off with a high-level view of biodiversity and set our subject in a broader sustainability context. So Eloise, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Let me just take control of the slides. So Mark started with a really great overview in terms of what do we actually mean when we're talking about biodiversity. And critically, it combines the words biological and diversity and explains the variety of animals that make up our world, all of nature, and how the different species and ecosystems interact with each other. It has become a more prevalent term within the sector, and critically, oh sorry, I've gone too far with my clicking. Critically, the challenge that we're actually facing is as humans put more pressure on the planet, that balance of ecosystems is being threatened and we're losing that critical biodiversity. So WWF's 2022 Living Planet report found that an average 69% decline in global population of mammals, fish, birds, reptiles and amphibians since 1970. A 2019 report by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services noted that up to 1 million plant and animal species are facing extinction globally, and that's specifically due to human activities. A large percentage of that human impact is in relation to habitat loss, with over half of the world's habitable land used for agriculture. And the most important thing to note is that climate change is both caused by and impacted by biodiversity loss. And it's important, therefore, to take this holistic and comprehensive approach to sustainability and sustainable development. Spoiler alert, you've seen that slide. At RSK Group, we take an approach to sustainability that's underpinned by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are a framework adopted by businesses to ensure the right kind of sustainable behaviour. And crucially, we view them within this wedding cake structure. So without biodiversity, life on land, life below water, healthy water systems and a balanced climate, there can be no society or economy and the corresponding sustainability initiatives. As with these shared goals, there are shared challenges for businesses and critically for the water sector. I've tried to sort of summarise and articulate some of them here, but in line with compliance and regulation, we have to control pollution and non-native species. In addition, there are opportunities to re-establish plants and species, particularly in relation to those protected in wetlands and freshwater environments. It's critical that the sector demonstrates alignment with stakeholders, certainly regarding the communities in which they operate. And the pressure on biodiversity created by those sort of legacy physical modifications is really critical, and the reinstatement of natural features present opportunities. The creation and maintenance of nature-based solutions requires a new way of thinking. And then finally, the measurement of the impact of these interventions is really important to demonstrating success, and then more broadly sharing best practice. Just to kind of demonstrate within the Sustainable Engineering Solutions division and the wider RSK Group services, we operate as a family of businesses to ensure access to those correct solutions, and addressing those biodiversity challenges means bringing in sort of wide-ranging approaches that move away from those traditional solutions and can often be reliant on those ecosystems in order to demonstrate those sort of solutions and benefits. As with other areas of sustainability, measured by a company's environmental performance, social impact and governance structures, the sort of doing no harm approach is no longer sufficient. Businesses need to be able to demonstrate what they're going to do to create a positive change. So policy measures such as the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed at COP15 last year in Montreal, the European Union's deforestation regulation and the UK's biodiversity net gain are designed to increase focus on nature considerations and then integrate these considerations into financial and business performance. So again, we're sort of looking really high level here, but in terms of biodiversity net gain, developers in England will be required to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain from January 2024 when building new housing, industrial or commercial developments, which means delivering a net positive for local environment, for example, creating new habitats and green spaces. And this quantification of protection of the natural environment is a new and evolving approach. And already there's some really great traction within a number of sectors, including the water sector. When it comes to achieving and maintaining biodiversity net gain, there's still some questions, and as we begin to quantify those impacts in line with the regulatory frameworks, the detail and the implementation mechanisms can sort of take time, and actually what's important is taking action now to deliver those benefits further down the line when that long-term maintenance of biodiversity net gain units will be important. From the broader view of sustainability, environmental, social and governance considerations, the key thing is ensuring that those actions are material and credible, and that they do deliver those meaningful impacts for habitats, for biodiversity and for local communities. So RSK Group have to date been involved in planning for the creation of biodiversity net gain units, but more importantly in the long-term development of landscape and ecological management plans, and it's the implementation of those plans alongside the upfront actions that the Sustainable Engineering Solutions division and the businesses within them are sort of focusing on to ensure that those the businesses that they work for can have that impact on reversing biodiversity loss in the future. So again, a really quick kind of overview of what that sort of means and how those terms perhaps work together. So back to you, I suppose, Mark.
No, that's great. Thanks very much, Eloise. I mean, really interesting. I think for a lot of time, I think people in the water sector, particularly those creating assets, have focused very much on the asset creation, and almost everything else has been sort of peripheral, and reinstatements have been minimum. And I think you mentioned, compliance and regulation. So it's almost been like minimum compliance for minimum costs, and everything else was sort of like covered in the do no harm. But if that's no longer good enough, which I think is what you just said, what shifts are you seeing in the water sector in relation to biodiversity, particularly from now going into AMP8, I guess, really?
And I think it is that just massively increased importance and that prevalence of holistic thought, and exactly as you say, that shift away from compliance, minimum activity, and into managing those increased stakeholder expectations, and how therefore sort of smaller localized initiatives can be scaled, and how the data and impact reporting that sits alongside them really contributes more broadly to that sustainability picture, and sort of not just seeing one part at a time. And again, we're seeing big increases in terms of what those expectations are and how they're being pushed down the value chain, so in terms of suppliers, and how they can be sort of demonstrating value and contributing to those targets and aims.
But I think giving your statement, about interventions are I guess need to be meaningful and credible, rather than just sort of I guess token would be the opposite to that. Then actually, what actions can businesses take in advance of regulation? Because you said this is going to come in 10% BNG by 2024, excuse me. And we've got a load, ESG, BNG, and people just throw their hands up in the air and say, right, more TLAs. So what actions do you think businesses can take in advance of regulation and to allow themselves to prepare for this?
And it is that identification of risk and opportunity, and understanding really what is material to your business operation. All businesses rely in some part on nature, and that understanding of that relationship and where those dependencies are is really important as a first step, because regardless of, as you say, that sort of regulatory environment, there is that opportunity to deliver benefits, but also that risk associated, real term risk associated with dependence on raw materials and nature. Again, it's really sort of re-examining the activity that's already underway through those different lenses, and then looking at how that extends up and down the value chain, and starting to take those first assessment and sort of impact understanding steps to think about what those opportunities might be in order to re-examine that focus and look at innovation, look at different ways of working, and look at different partners in the market.
Yeah, and I do think we're at a sort of point of inflection, really, from grey to green, or from concrete to software engineering. And I think looking back in some years' time, I think it will be really, really interesting to see how the business both struggles and then embraces, I think, actually, because to me, the direction of travel is set and it's not going to go any other way. Okay, Eloise, look, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll have other questions at the end of it. So if you can hang on towards the end, and we'll come back to you. Okay, so as I said, next up is I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Phoebe Carter. And Phoebe is a chartered environmentalist with over 20 years working in nature conservation. So following her attaining her PhD in aquatic veterinary studies from the University of Stirling, she was investigating the impacts on pollution on aquatic life. And this has continued really with a lifelong fascination for her with freshwater and marine habitats, working in the UK and overseas. And before joining RSK Nature Positive as a principal environmental consultant, she spent 15 years working as an ecologist for a developer. I was teasing her about the developer side, but she did say that it was a good developer because it was focused on building biodiversity into every aspect of development. So that's great. And I think as a building with nature assessor, she has been able to work with developers to find ways to manage water that help minimize the risks and impacts associated with climate and biodiversity crisis. So I think this is something that's really, 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 really important. She's also traveled extensively. And I noticed in her LinkedIn, she's worked in Norfolk Island in the South Pacific as an ecologist. And she's also worked with the conservation of green turtles in Cyprus. But most impressed, being from Swindon, she's also spent a year looking after the otters and voles in the Cotswold Water Park just up the road. So I think Phoebe will be taking us into the heart of biodiversity in the marine ecosystem and outline some of the challenges we face. So Phoebe, over to you, please.
Thank you. You weren't supposed to mention the Swindon part.
Oh no, well that's very, very important, especially the local mink in Swindon. They're quite tough, you know.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit more about biodiversity and the threats that it faces in the aquatic environment. So when we think of biodiversity in relation to aquatic environments, it's usually the big sort of iconic species that we think of first. Oh, sorry, hang on a minute. Let's just see. There we go. And the big iconic species like these, like the great whales. Now, these are really important in their own right, obviously, for biodiversity. But equally now, they've been shown to be really important for carbon capture. So each great whale is supposed to sort of sequester around 33 tons of carbon dioxide in their lifetime. And because of this, the International Monetary Fund has now given them an economic value in total of $1 trillion for their carbon capturing abilities. So it's sort of doubly important that we prevent the loss of these keystone species, and they are sort of suffering through a variety of losses. In freshwater, sort of keystone species that we think of maybe at the minute, everyone's very focused on the beaver. I've been very fortunate to work with those for about 10 years. And I was able to watch how they shaped an environment from what was quite a nice environment, but to something that was incredible, sort of escalating the amount of habitat that was available for a wide variety of species that hadn't been present before, and which sort of came along as a result of sort of the engineering of the beavers. But aquatic ecosystems are much more, more about sort of species that we don't see, perhaps. So if we think about the filter feeding whales, they wouldn't survive without the millions and millions of tons of krill that they sort of rely on as food. And if you look at that image on the left, that looks fairly boring, but that's phytoplankton, and these microscopic single-celled photosynthetic organisms are actually responsible for producing about 50% of our oxygen needs. In addition, they're the primary source of essential fatty acids, producing fatty acids like DHA21, and the fatty acids obviously sort of are passed up through the food chain as the phytoplankton are consumed and then end up in the fish. And obviously this is in sort of a major nutrient source for billions of people around the world who rely on fish for livelihoods and for food as well. But the ongoing effects of climate change are impacting phytoplankton along with everything else, and it's predicted now that the phytoplankton over the next 80 years will be producing between sort of 10 and 60% less of these essential fatty acids due to warming waters. And obviously this is going to have a cascading effect on the nutrient content of species further up the food chain, and ultimately potentially on human health as well. So it's really important we protect sort of these sort of aquatic ecosystems because they provide us with so many services that we're totally reliant on. So if we think about these services, these are ecosystem services. So there's sort of 4 key services. We've got provisioning services. So these are the harvestable goods that you can get from the oceans and freshwater. So you're thinking of fish and shellfish, seaweed. There's medicines as well that are coming from the oceans. And you're also looking at things like timber from mangroves. We've got our regulating services. So these are coastal protection, prevention of erosion, water purification, carbon storage. We've got our supporting services, photosynthesis and nutrient cycling. We've got cultural services. So these are the non-material benefits that are derived from nature. So recreation, tourism, cultural benefits, those sorts of things. When we consider the whole blue economy, which covers sort of tourism, fisheries and shipping, there's an estimated value on that blue economy of $24 trillion US. And the shipping part is really important because 90% of our global goods are actually transported by ship. I think we often think of everything as being on the roads because that's where we see it, but actually 90% is transported via shipping. In addition to this blue economy, 600 million livelihoods are dependent partially or wholly on fisheries and on aquaculture. But all of these ecosystems are under threat. Oh, sorry, there's a bit of a lag. There we go. All of these systems are under threat from a variety of different impacts. So we've got climate change, which is causing more extreme sea temperatures. It's causing coral bleaching, oxygen depletion. We're getting more extreme weather events, which is impacting coastal habitats. And we're getting increased ocean acidity. And even things like the wildfire increase, which is a result of climate change, is impacting our aquatic ecosystems. The wildfires release a variety of sort of aerosols and particulates of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sort of trace metals. Those get blown across by wind and then deposited by rain into aquatic ecosystems. And the recent Australian wildfires saw deposition of nutrients into the Southern Ocean, which caused major phytoplankton blooms, and it also caused the loss of fish and invertebrates in several of the estuaries as well. Other forms of pollution, we're thinking about, if you look at the Gulf of Mexico, there's miles and miles of dead zones. So this is totally devoid of oxygen as a result of nutrient loading from intensive pig farming in the area. The oxygen at such low levels that marine life can't survive. In freshwaters, we've got issues with microplastics. It's estimated that in a single Welsh sort of wastewater treatment plant, around 650 million microplastic particles pass through that every day. The issue with that then is that the sewage sludge from these wastewater treatment plants are often used on agricultural fields, and those microplastics then can pass into the food chain and get washed back into aquatic ecosystems as well. We've also got issues with invasive species, particularly being transported in ballast water of ships. So our edible crab from the UK made its way in ballast water to Canada in the 1950s and has now outcompeted native species of crab and other species, and having a real impact on the ecosystems there. And most people will know this is a signal crayfish. So these were brought to the UK in the 1970s to be farmed as a food source. They escaped. They're now doing particularly well. And they're outcompeting our native white-clawed crayfish, and they've carried crayfish plague, which has killed off many of our native species. And they also cause extensive habitat damage through their burrowing as well. The only good thing about these is that otters love to eat them, so that's the only beneficial part about signal crayfish, in my opinion, and they taste good. Overfishing is endangering our ocean ecosystems. unless we sort of sort out how to manage this sustainably, it's going to be a real problem for billions of people around the world. One of the biggest issues is mega trawling. Obviously, not only is this taking out tons and tons of fish, it's catching considerable amounts of bycatch. So we're thinking things like dolphins, sharks, sea turtles, just among a few of those things. And it's also responsible, because of its seabed damage, to releasing about a gigaton of carbon annually, which is about the equivalent to the aviation industry. So a real significant problem. And then there's obviously the problem of ghost fishing equipment that's left behind, which causes entanglement and death of many creatures, such as whales and dolphins. So our aquatic and wetland ecosystems are really vulnerable to climate change. So the projected increases in temperature are expected to disrupt the present patterns of plant and animal distribution in aquatic ecosystems. But the migratory corridors that these would need to move through to get to sort of better conditions for them have probably been altered so significantly by us that they're not going to be able to relocate, which means we're going to have increased species extinction and loss of biodiversity. Aquatic organisms are really sensitive to changes in frequency, duration and timing of extreme precipitation events like flooding and droughts, and we all know that those are increasing as well. So how do we conserve these ecosystems? Well, with only around 7% of the ocean, or the global ocean, sort of currently under some form of protection, and sort of our legislations around rivers, particularly in the UK, seem to be being reduced. There's a lot that needs to be done to protect these ecosystems. The most recent figures published by the Environment Agency for 2021-22 showed that only 14% of English rivers were in good ecological condition, and none of our rivers met good chemical status. So that's really concerning. And obviously we're pumping sewage in for millions of hours worth of sewage is being pumped into our rivers and streams in the UK as well. In marine environments, one of the best ways to protect sort of fisheries and the environment is marine protected areas. Highly marine protected areas are areas where there's absolutely no fishing whatsoever. In the UK, these only account for 0.01% of England's waters. But in these areas where there's no fishing at all, you've got a tonnage of fish per hectare that's 6 times greater than elsewhere. So while fishermen can't fish in these areas, the reproduction rates are so good, and the numbers of fish and shellfish and other species increase to such an extent that they sort of overspill out of these areas. So fishermen benefit from fishing in the areas outside of these marine protected areas. There's been a recent High Seas Treaty, which is a promising step forward. And this is the United Nations member countries that have agreed a treaty to protect the world's oceans that lie outside of national boundaries. And their aim is to protect sort of 30% of the ocean by 2030. With regard to shipping and invasive species, there's now an international convention for the control and management of ships' ballast water and sediments. And that should help to stop transfer of invasive species and also pathogens as well, which are transported in these ballast water. So while there's some really positive moves to protect our aquatic environments, there's still an awful lot to do until everybody recognises that businesses and everybody's everyday lives are dependent on these environments, and until the government sort of take the necessary steps to protect and restore them as much as they should, we're not going to be able to make those differences that we need to sort of reverse the damage that's already been done. Thank you.
So thank you. I mean, amazing numbers there actually, Phoebe. Some was it 24 trillion in the blue economy? You know, that's an incredibly high number, isn't it? But also the fact that it's a bit depressing that only 7% of global oceans are under protection. And I think, you know, your comments and your about the state of UK rivers probably won't come to as a surprise to anybody. But I guess just 2 questions come to mind. What are we trying to achieve here? What's the baseline we're heading for? You know, there is a global population of, you know, rising 7 to 8 billion. In the UK, we've got 65 million people here and growing. We can't turn back the clock to pre-industrialization. So what's the end point here? What are we trying to get to, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's quite an important, obviously very important question. And if you were to sort of Google all the things that say we need to reverse nature or whatever, it's actually very difficult to find anybody who mentions reverse it to what. And I think maybe focusing on that baseline, it might end up sort of detracting from the job we've got in hand, which is the fact that we just need to crack on and get on with it and try and stop the net loss now, so that we can sort of start to get a net, sort of a net gain. So I think, I'm not sure what the actual baseline is, but I think we've got to perhaps not focus on that so much and just try and prevent further damage and start that restoration process now.
Okay, I think we can do better than 0% of our rivers having good chemical status, though. I think that would be.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Fingers crossed. Our government will help us.
and I guess the sort of second one to the first really is, how do we fund all this? How is it all funded?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to have to come from private and public sector funding, definitely. And I think as more businesses look at the impacts on their supply chain, I hope there'll be investment then. I think that one of the better ways is going to be through nature-based solutions. New York City did that. I think New York City State did that in the 1990s. They needed to build a massive wastewater treatment plant at vast cost, but actually what they did in the end was incentivize and pay farmers sort of in the upper watershed, and paid them to sort of put in more natural solutions to enhance water quality, and they ended up spending less on that than they did in having to put in a grey infrastructure treatment plant. So I think nature-based solutions will be the way forward, and I think there'll be investment in that. But it is going to be a big issue, but it has to be long term as well. That's the thing. We can't just have funding that ticks the box of a little project and then we all just walk away. There has to be funding in that to maintain that as fit for purpose going on and on for sort of generations.
I think that's a really, really important point, actually, that whole idea that somehow we can fix it and then go back to what it used to be like. I think we're talking about, if we are interested in sort of having that sort of biodiversity and environmental sort of value, we're going to have to pay for it long term, and it's going to have to be many, many billions over many, many decades going forward. Yeah. And I think at the moment that perhaps that honest conversation isn't being had with the public. So, but anyway, look, thank you so much, Phoebe. That's really, really interesting, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. So, I just want to move on to our final speaker, who's I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Richard Unsworth from Project Seagrass, and it's great that Richard has managed to. He's a very busy man. He's lots of demands in his time, but he's managed to squeeze us in. So I'm really, really pleased he's here. So Richard is currently an associate professor in marine ecology at Swansea University, and also is the chief scientific officer and one of the founders, I think, of Project Seagrass. So as a leading voice in seagrass conservation, Richard has, I see it's down here, Richard authored over 140 academic articles and reports, and had your work featured in the global media on a number of occasions. So I think I'm not surprised you're very busy. And you actually collaborated with the team to transform this academic research into conservation action by helping set up Project Seagrass. The other thing I guess I should mention is you probably have the coolest patron of everybody here, because in December 21, Coldplay accepted an invitation to become the official patrons of Project Seagrass and act as global ambassadors for seagrass conservation on behalf of Project Seagrass. So I'm really looking forward to this section. You're going to talk to us about supercharging seagrass restoration for planetary health, which is great to follow on from what Phoebe just said. So over to you, Richard. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Eloise and Phoebe, for those great talks. It was those sort of final comments from Phoebe were quite a nice introduction to what I'm talking about today, and the context of how we manage our oceans and how we make progress on things like nature-based solutions. So thank you for that. Let me see if I can navigate these slides, move through them. Maybe not. Hang on. Let me try again. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about how we're supercharging seagrass restoration for planetary health. So we recently did a review looking at the global sustainable development goals established by the United Nations, and when we looked at the 17 main goals, actually 16 of them relate to marine conservation, specifically seagrass restoration. So not if you conserve or restore one meadow, you may not be supporting 16 of the goals, but projects around the world are supporting 16 of those 17 goals. And I think that reflects the importance of this topic. So for me, seagrass is just an amazing habitat that it's easy to get lost in if you go for a snorkel. It's a very calming experience to put on a snorkel and mask and go for a shallow water snorkel. These habitats live in a shallow water environment, so they're after many of the same things that a yachty might be after: a shallow water, soft sediment, very sheltered location. They're quite sort of sensitive to high levels of hydrodynamic pressure, so waves and high currents they don't do so well in. But when they do well, they proliferate and they form these really extensive habitats that are just full of life. Everything from cuttlefish laying their eggs to pipefish to juvenile cod, juvenile plaice, little herring popping around. An immense amount of life is present in a seagrass meadow. It often takes a while to see that because things are in seagrass because they're trying to hide, and they're hiding from predators. They're trying to utilize the food hidden amongst it. So if you just lie there still, then you'll begin to see things that start to pop out. But they're amazing habitats. And the ability to restore these habitats reflects their value to people and planet. Increasingly, they're being recognised for their ability to rapidly store carbon. Although that value is highly variable. So what we might see in somewhere like the Isles of Scilly versus a lagoon on the south coast of England are very, very different. So there is no sort of hard and fast rule that all seagrasses do the same thing. But broadly, they're quite good at storing carbon. They create this home for biodiversity because they've got a three-dimensional structure. It's basically full of immense amounts of life, whether that be the microbial, fungal, invertebrate or fish level. It's all there on show. As a result, there's a significant role that seagrasses play in supporting fisheries, filtering water, creating places for recreation and tourism, a place for things like birds to feed. They're an incredible life force on our planet, and basically human history is very, very closely associated with seagrass. In some parts of the world it's very well documented, in others not so. But this picture here is from a catch of herring in North Wales. Herring used to be a very, very abundant fishery in the UK. It was a standard food item on people's plates in the 17th, 18th century, but stocks collapsed. And if you read the literature around the collapse of herring, it's very much the view that we as humans, as fishermen, overexploited the resources. I think there's a fair argument that a lot of that story is correct. You know, we were taking vast amounts of herring and supporting whole cities with that fish. But at the same time, we were destroying our coastlines. We were building port after port. We were reclaiming land at an unprecedented scale. We were putting causeways across estuary mouths, and with it we were changing the sediment flux throughout that whole environment. And something that, like seagrass, that's very delicate, that can't deal with high sediment loads, would have been largely wiped out. At the same time, we were ripping out our oysters, we were polluting our rivers, and it's not surprising that we got to a scenario where we don't really know how much seagrass ever existed in the UK, but we know it was a lot more than it is now. Models suggest that it might be somewhere between 50 and 92%. I think it's in that 90% range, but we will never have the evidence because it's hard enough to look at seagrass when you've got GoPro cameras and sonars and drones. So you can imagine that the ability to see it back in 1800 would have been quite limited. And these issues that we've seen for seagrass are not unique to the UK. We've seen a lot of loss in other parts of the UK, and we're still seeing that loss. Issues of nutrient pollution, turbidity, general disturbance from fisheries, shipping are all factors that are driving the continual loss of seagrass. Although there are some rays of hope. We've seen recent examples of seagrass increasing the extent in the Maldives, in parts of Pacific Ocean, and more importantly, we're seeing a movement for change to actually support the conservation and ultimately the restoration of these seagrasses all around the world, and that's a really exciting time to be part of this as well. So back in 2010, I remember speaking to groups in Natural England, what was then Countryside Council for Wales, and they thought I was a lunatic, the idea that we could actually restore seagrasses. Seagrasses are of importance. But what we're seeing globally is that where people are taking a long-term view towards restoration, where they're using science to drive that, they're restoring seagrass at huge scale. Over 3,000 hectares of seagrass was restored over a 30-year period in the Virginia Bays and Chesapeake Bay area, and that's resulted in huge invertebrate biomass, fisheries provision. Fishermen are actually able to clearly articulate that they're making more money now than they were previously because of the fact of the seagrass there, and that's an amazing thing to see. And nitrogen cycling, carbon stocks, these things are all rapidly increasing as a result of restoration. And at Project Seagrass, what we've been doing over the last decade, and including some involvement with one of your colleagues, David Holland, within Salix Bioengineering, that you guys may or may not be aware of. They've been integrated into RSK. We've been working, we started the journey of restoration with them, and we've recently got involved with working on restoration with them more recently. But broadly, Project Seagrass, we've been using science to push forward restoration in a whole range of different environments. And we started some research projects in about 2015, and we've played with a series of different methods. We're trying to understand why some methods work, why we've had successes and failures, but broadly we're heading in the right direction. We've got seagrasses growing at 10 different sites around the UK now that didn't previously have seagrass in them. Some of those are still going well. Some of them we've had a few disasters. We had some geese come in and recently graze at one site, and we had a storm wipe out most of the seagrass at another site. But broadly, we're doing pretty well. We're using the best ecological science, modelling, mapping work, and working with all the stakeholders and communities to ensure that we can push forward seagrass restoration, get the science right, and create some amazing projects. Part of that is that restoration generally, when it sort of matures, it tends to head into the direction of needing nursery resources, either to grow mature plants, to collect seeds, to for scientific purposes, and that's how the collaboration with Salix Bioengineering has grown. In that Project Seagrass have developed a partnership with Salix and RSK in Pendine in West Wales to create the UK's first operational seagrass nursery, and that's about using the best science, the best knowledge on seagrasses to improve restoration and try and think about how we can actually do this at some level of decent scale. And that's what we're now succeeding with. We've finished a pilot phase, it is working, and we have seagrass growing. I saw a beautiful photo this morning from one of our team, picking up the seagrass out of one of those trays that you can see in the picture there, and seeing the dense roots that are present there, and then I'm separating them out into further tanks to grow it and expand next summer. So we're making a lot of progress in that place, and it's something that we'll be continuing to partner with Salix on going forward. And our sort of intent is to essentially run an operational business that's co-owned by Project Seagrass and Salix to be at the forefront of seagrass restoration. And there's a lot of problems in that. We encounter lots of issues that we're learning more about, but we're rapidly getting answers to many of those queries. And by working with international experts, we're pushing forward on that science. With many bottlenecks, and things we've got to solve, but ultimately, what we're now seeing in many places are seagrass that is being restored to healthy habitats full of life. And sorry, I ran over slightly, but thank you very much for listening.
No, thanks very much, Richard. I mean, it's fantastic news about the seagrass nursery up and running now, because I guess that's sort of that will ultimately enable you to sort of achieve results at scale, which I think is probably what we're talking about. I mean, if you say that we've lost 90% of our seagrass, how realistic is it really to restore it at scale in the UK, given that the changes to the coastline are sort of locked in, aren't they, in a lot of places? So have the sediments adopted, or do we have to adopt now to the changing coastline? How realistic is it to expect that?
We're take the view that there is no such thing as pristine or there is no baseline. What we're trying to understand now is where seagrass can actually grow. We're trying to model the right environment for seagrass. Think about can we plant seagrass there, and if we plant seagrass there, will it be of benefit to biodiversity and to people? And so there's all sorts of big figures bandied around about how much seagrass should or shouldn't be there, but ultimately there is a lot of shallow, unvegetated, often low diversity, muddy, sandy habitats around the UK that could have seagrass on them in the future. And I think by using science, we can get to that place and have far more extensive marine habitats and biodiversity and more productive fisheries and all sorts of things that go with that.
Well, I think the work done in Chesapeake Bay and stuff, 3,000 hectares, and the benefits that arrive from that, that's quite persuasive, isn't it? I think. But I mean, overall, however, marine net gain is expected to appear on the radar quite soon of the environmental impact assessments. And how do you think seagrass will benefit that? How do you think it'll relate to that? Because ultimately, I think a lot of people will be looking as well at the carbon aspect of seagrass, the ability to sequester carbon through seagrass growth, which I know you said was variable, but it's ultimately there. So do you think this marine net gain will push things your way, I guess?
I think it's a huge opportunity for seagrass restoration. The strongest evidence we have about the value of seagrass really is that wherever you go, it's got animals in it, diverse animal life, and there's a food web that's associated to it. And if you bring back seagrass, you bring back biodiversity, and there's no grey area in that debate. It's very black and white, and I think that it does bring an opportunity. Challenges are that seagrass restoration is not simple, and there's a lot of failure that goes with it. The science is quite young. There are lots of knowledge gaps that we need to fill, and with it I think there's a challenge around expectations of what can be achieved very rapidly. But as Phoebe was talking about, if you want to restore the marine environment, you need to take a long-term approach, and that's not about one little project here, one little project there. It's about, you know, ambition for a region, ambition for a catchment, for a big project that many actors can get involved with, and that's what we need is that scale of working together. And the example of Chesapeake Bay was that was major stakeholders, regulators, scientists, organisations working together to achieve a bigger aim, and they achieved it.
They also had to work very hard with farming, didn't they? Because I'm aware there was a lot of problems with Chesapeake dead zones that Phoebe was talking about due to nutrient overloads. So it wasn't just let's clean up the bit of water and grow some seagrass. It was, you know, for anybody who doesn't know Chesapeake, it's a massive sort of ecosystem on the east coast of North America. So I think it's really worth it. There's a lot of research comes out of there, a lot of data comes out of there. So it's great to have that as a bit of a reminder of the benefits in the background. So thank you very much, Richard. I think really interesting, lots to think about. So maybe if I could ask everybody to come back on screen, because we've had a few questions come in, and just see if we can just have a quick chat. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but just a couple of ones really. Is Eloise there? She is. So I think Eloise, actually, one of the ones that's come through, I think, is you mentioned the 69% decline in biodiversity, and we're being asked, do you have any stats as to how this is distributed across the world? Is the loss more present in developing or developed countries, or do we not know, or, you know, what's the data bank looking like?
Thanks. It's a really interesting question, and I think Phoebe and Richard have sort of delved into a bit more detail around the specific impacts of some species and some sort of geographies. The WWF report is certainly a recommended read, and has lots of data and information.
Sorry, which report is this, Eloise? Sorry, which one? So
it's the 2022 biodiversity. So I can send a link through Living Planet report. I can send a link through. And again, it's a really great collection of all of that data and information. And yes, as you would anticipate, particularly those nations that are particularly resource rich and have the biggest sort of biodiversity populations have seen the biggest declines in terms of biodiversity since sort of in that sort of time frame. So again, a UK average loss of around 19% versus a 94% decline in Latin America and the Caribbean.
So I think actually that's probably not surprising, and I suppose it's what you'd expect. A question actually to you, Richard, that sort of, do you do much work with the water companies, the privatized water companies? I guess in Wales is Welsh Water, but you know most of them have coastline, haven't they? So are they sort of engaged in Project Seagrass? Do you see them much in your world?
The project funding that we got for the pilot phase work at Pendine was as part of an Ofwat challenge fund, and the industry partner in there was Affinity Water from Essex. They're more of a supply side entity rather than sewage treatment, but we are seeing a bit more interest in that space, and there's lots of complex arguments around a lot of that work, but I think they have to be a major collaborator in the space that are not really involved at the moment, and I think that in the long term, I think they will begin to realise that they have to get involved.
I think the whatever about the pollution side of things, I think in the past, I think certainly the drive towards carbon net zero will perhaps help them as well in that. And I think certainly having some solid data around, you know, the carbon sequestration potential of seagrass meadows, I think would be of real interest to something within the industry. Which I guess sort of really, Phoebe, can we talk, spend a minute, microplastics? You mentioned microplastics. This is something that's close to my heart. Basically, at the moment, we have a water industry that treats sewage and produces sludge, digests that sludge and extracts the biogas, and then spreads the remaining sludge on the agricultural land. Now, digestion does a lot of good things, but it doesn't destroy microplastics as far as I'm aware, and it doesn't destroy PFOS and PFAS. Ultimately, these wash off the fields into the rivers and ultimately into the marine environment. Do you see this as being an area of sort of a new area of research? Because again, microplastics is like a new pollutant that's appeared, or do you think that there is a serious attempt now to look at the whole sort of biosolid sludge strategy across the UK and Europe?
I don't think it's particularly new in terms of, I think microplastics were identified a long time ago, but obviously, as with everything, it seems to have taken a long time to, I suppose, to become mainstream, doesn't it, as an idea. I do hope that there's going to be some new thought on it. If anyone else is as boring as me and listens to Farming Today at 6 o'clock in the morning, they were they were talking about it and about the sewage sludge issue only last week about it, and about how saying, you know, how they really want that change as well, because obviously, as you mentioned, there's chemicals, there's Teflon, you know, all of those sort of things that are getting into sort of the agricultural system as well as these aquatic systems. So I hope that if the farming industry get on board more, that's such a big sort of a big industry, that hopefully it would become more of an issue to try and minimize these microplastics, more so than just taking them out of cosmetics, you know, looking at them in a much bigger scale. But ultimately it comes down, we've just got to reduce the amount of plastic that we're producing and using as well.
I mean, it comes around again to the, you know, just refer back to the Chesapeake Bay, it's leadership, national leadership. And I guess ultimately just a quick one really to finish up, really, that I'll throw this to you, Eloise, it's a difficult one. Should water companies become catchment management organizations? Should water companies really move away from being asset owners towards environmental management organizations? Could you answer that in about 30 seconds? I'd be delighted if you could.
I just start with saying it's a very interesting question, an interesting conversation. I think more critically, it's about that stakeholder engagement piece. It's, you know, the feasibility of that is, you know, to be discussed at length. But I think in terms of actually understanding who those key partners are within those catchment approaches, and ensuring that those stakeholders have a voice in those conversations, and that we're representing the stakeholders who don't have a voice in terms of biodiversity and the species that we're impacting, is probably more important than sort of redefining exactly who's doing exactly what function within that. So
I think that's fabulously diplomatically correct answer. But ultimately, I think if we disappear down rabbit holes about structures, I think sometimes we miss what we're trying to achieve. And I think that's something that we probably have all experienced in our world. I mean, ultimately, what I think I've heard today is we all need part of it. There needs to be get behind a national program here, really. And I think biodiversity, nobody will argue against biodiversity. But overall, it's been a fantastic discussion, and I don't want to hold you beyond the time. So I want to just remains for me really to thank Richard, Eloise, Phoebe. I think it's been, I hope everybody's learned something from it, been stimulated a bit by it. Get in touch or whatever, and we'll see you all at the next one in a month's time. And I think we're going to tackle another easy subject, which is about carbon net zero, achieving it. So thank you all very much, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.